I'm Rob Hopkins. I'm one of your hosts for this evening, and I'm joined from Somerset by Anita Roy, who you just met, who some of you might know from Transition Town Wellington, and who has featured in some of these webinars in the past, just up the M5 from us here. Anita, maybe you might just give a quick hello. The people have already met you, but a little quick formal.
Hello,
Nice.
here I am.
Thank you. So, our theme for this evening is scaling up, and it's an issue that has been discussed in the transition movement ever since its inception, way back. So, in the Transition Companion, which is still my favorite book about transition, one of the ingredients in that book is called scaling up. And it suggests, quote, when the time is right, evolve your initiative to take the steps your organization needs to be most effective as the world around it changes. Hold to your purpose and values. These will help the group retain its identity and effectiveness amid great change. And so 13 years since that was written, we've seen transition projects that have scaled up and become multi-million pound businesses, while others are content to stay the size that they are, doing what they do and what they know that they can do well. So there's a strong case to be made for both. This evening is absolutely not about saying that every transition group everywhere needs to hugely scale up immediately, but it's definitely an option for some projects, and that's what we're going to explore this evening. It's an option that we should be open to. I'm going to hand back to Anita for the next bit.
Thank you, Rob. So our conversation this evening is about really what it takes to do scaling up well. What are the learnings from across the movement of what works and what doesn't? What kind of speed and scale are necessary in view of where we're at the moment in our world's history? And how can that be inclusive and ethical and dynamic? How do we stay true to the impulses that got us going in the first place? And what are the new systems and structures that we need, the stepping stones towards our dreams of a better future? Today, we're going to be hearing from some real pioneers. They're at different stages of their journey. Some are at the very start of that, and others have just turbocharged their beams into the stratosphere. These are amazing and inspiring stories of change. But before we get to them, I'd like to introduce two very special people who are joining us tonight as keynote listeners. Now, this was a new concept to me, but I really like it. Instead of keynote speakers, we have keynote listeners. These are amazing people who have sort of got the task of listening closely to everything that's said tonight, reflecting on some of those ideas, and reflecting back to us. We'll be inviting them to do that towards the end of the evening, on all of the things that have bubbled up through this conversation. We couldn't hope for better listeners than Anthea and Nick. They're amazing. Anthea Lawson is a campaigner and author who's worked on campaigns to shut down tax havens, prevent banks from facilitating corruption and environmental devastation, and control the arms trade. And at Global Witness, she launched a prize-winning campaign that changed the rules on secret company ownership and resulted in new laws in dozens of countries. Many of you may know her as the author of a really brilliant book, The Entangled Activist, which shines a light on why activists themselves so often up recreating the problems that they're trying to fix. Fascinating book and well worth a read. So very warm welcome to Anthea. And welcome also to our other keynote listener, Nick Romeo. Nick covers policy and ideas for The New Yorker, and he also teaches at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California in Berkeley, from where he's joining us. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Rolling Stones. Rolling Stones? No, he hasn't written for the Rolling Stones, just the magazine. As far as I know, not the band. His latest book is called The Alternative, and it sets out a model of what an alternative to capitalism might look like, how that might function, and how in many cases it already is functioning. So we'll be hearing from Nick and Anthea during the course of the evening, and we're just delighted to have them here with their ears set to maximum receptivity for what's about to follow. And back to Rob.
So, yes, we are going to start with 4 short presentations, 2 from transition groups who are at the beginning of their journey of thinking about scaling up, and 2 who are much further along that journey. And they will all tell us their stories. They'll have 8 minutes each to take us on their journey. So let's get started with that. So first up, I would like to introduce Samantha Woods and Taruna Mistry from Transition Leicester. Sam has been an active member of the transition movement since 2008 and is a qualified permaculture teacher, as well as just an amazing organizer and empowerer of grassroots community enterprises. And Taruna Mistry runs a CIC called Leicester Community Links that works across the city on mental and physical health and well-being, focusing on empowering local people, and particularly those in underserved parts of the community to take action. The CIC and Transition Leicester have partnered on a really exciting new phase of their work. This is about scaling up, scaling out, and scaling deep, a real 3D project and approach, which we're very excited to hear about. So huge thanks to Samantha and Taruna for being here this evening to share their story with us. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Rob. Max, could we have the first slide, please? So Transition Leicester, I'll say a little bit about our history and how we came together with Leicester Community Links. But this project is really about scaling up by working together across the whole of the different communities of Leicester. So it brings together actually 3 organisations. So along with Leicester Community Links and Transition Leicester, we're also working with Hindu Climate Action, which is a national organisation, and I believe Avnish from Hindu Climate Action is in the room. So hi, Avnish. So yes, this is a 3-way partnership. We are the recipients of some seed funding from the Transition Network. So thank you very much for that, to get this project off the ground. So it's a new project for Leicester. Could I have the next slide, please, Max? So for those of you that are not familiar with Leicester, we are in the middle of England. We are a medium-sized city with a population of about 360,000 people, but we have no ethnic majority in Leicester. So we have a whole mixture of communities living here. We've had waves of different kind of immigration over hundreds of years, and many of our communities are very settled. Alongside the kind of white British people, for example, we've just celebrated 50 years of having our Ugandan and other African Asians arrive, fleeing from persecution 50 years ago. But 11% of Leicester's population across different communities speak Gujarati. So when we came together to look at the kind of climate awareness raising that we are going to be doing through this project, having that translated into Gujarati and working with Gujarati speakers gives us a really strong outreach across the city, across different ethnicities and different religious groups. So the reason that Transition Leicester's kind of teamed up with these different organisations. So as an organisation, we've been going since 2008. And we have gone through different periods of energy, I guess. So I like to kind of use this idea of a bulb and the flowering field. So when we first started back in 2008, we set up a lot of projects very quickly, a lot of which are still going and are kind of like our flowering field. But our steering group was made up of a small core of people. And gradually over time, those people have kind of gone off and either run these projects that are listed on the screen now. So if we got the next slide up, sorry. Sorry, I should have asked you to change the slide. Sorry. Yeah, so we've set up a whole range of different projects over the time that Transition Leicester has been in existence. But we've kind of gone through these different periods of flowering and then coming back into the kind of bulb state, more of a hiatus, as people have either suffered from burnout or gone off to do different things in their lives. And so this project that brings together these 3 organisations is, for me, a kind of like the first green shoots coming out of that bulb that we've nurtured and kept alive, even during a kind of quieter time that we've had since the COVID years, I guess. Sorry, could I have the next slide, please, Max? So the way that this project arose originally was through some work that I was doing through my day job, but I was doing some climate awareness workshops with different groups across Leicester City, but the workshop format was very much based on my experience as a transition facilitator and using kind of transition ways of talking to and listening to people, and particularly kind of listening to what communities need. And so it was through that I kind of came across Taruna, and Taruna's group was one of the most enthusiastic groups wanting to take things forward from this initial series of workshops. So I'm going to pass over to Taruna now, and she's going to talk a bit more about the whole scaling up of this through the project that we have planned.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Okay, yeah. So our social enterprise, Leicester Community Links, is fairly new. We're 3 years old. The social sort of cause for our enterprise is well-being, and we emphasize better physical health and support mental health as well. But through the activities we have been delivering for the last few years, it was clear that there needs to be more awareness on climate awareness and climate action. So through our activities, we identified that. I felt it was a great opportunity to link up with Sam to give a platform to a lot of the diverse communities in Leicester who don't come forward to find out a little bit more about what climate awareness, what climate action means. And so having reached out and worked with Hindu Climate Action, which is another group who's been doing great work in Leicester, in going out into the grassroots communities, talking about climate action in a more relatable way, and getting people really interested in that conversation. We felt they would be really good partners to take this message forward in terms of raising awareness. So the main sort of project idea is to train a number of Hindu community connectors to deliver a number of workshops through the city, and it's a pilot project, and to identify sort of faith groups who may be a good platform to do the workshops with, and it would be a pilot project so that we can gain learning from it to see if our approach is the right approach, to getting people on board, because I think one of the biggest challenges that we might have is convincing people that it's important, because we tend to find climate action, climate awareness goes in and out of news a lot, and we want to sort of make it a permanent conversation. So working with faith organisations in the city to convince them that climate action, climate awareness is not going anywhere, and to be part of that conversation through this project is really important to us. So that's what we intend to do. The Gujarati is the main language spoken by the Hindu community, but as well as that, the majority of the Muslim community speak Gujarati as well. So we are going to be delivering this project bilingual, using that as a main focus in terms of...
Taruna, you've got 1 more minute. Sorry, you've got 1 more minute.
So we're going to be using that as a main focus. So yeah, that's in a nutshell in terms of what the project is. I don't know if Sam wants to sort of interject with the rest of the slides and go from there.
No, I think that pretty much covers it, Taruna. I think we're at the early stages of this project, so it's going to be really exciting to kind of feed back on how this goes, and to just see then how we can take it even further into the wider communities of Leicester and across some of the other language groups and groups that have been quite excluded from the climate conversation. Yeah, but thank you so much for letting us come and speak to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Taruna.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And very exciting to see the translation of the message getting out there to a community that's really needs it, and also has maybe not found it that easy to get involved in that conversation so far. Thanks very much, Samantha and Taruna. I would like to now hand over to Craig Dunn from the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network, SCAN. who are the partner organisation to Transition Together north of the border. Craig is currently operations lead at SCAN, where he spends most of his time trying not to get in the way of the good people that are there, apparently. Previously, he ran the Neudart Foundation for 5 successful years, and this incorporated community-run energy, housing, land management, tourism, retail, hostel, and ranger services. And previously, for his sins, he worked extensively in marketing and outdoor activities. So, Craig, up in Scotland, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Anita, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here. So if we could have the slides up, please. I think we can skip the first slide, which was about me, and you've already heard the boring bit. So we'll go on to this project that I want to talk to you about, which is a project SCAN was involved in, which is the Climate Hub network that we bid for and set up in Scotland, which was a project to set up 20 geographically strategic climate hubs across the country. SCAN's been around for a long time. Traditionally, it was a volunteer member-led organisation, but that all changed when it applied for and was granted this money to launch the Scottish Government's Climate Action Hubs. The idea being that we could set up a number of these strategically placed hubs that local organisations could plug into and would provide a local focus for action. The hubs themselves would become communities of practice, and they would do all the usual sharing of information and sharing of best practice that we all know works well, essentially becoming a network of networks. And at the last count at the beginning of March, we had successfully set up 20 of these hubs. But I want to talk to you about the challenge of setting up these hubs and the effect that it had on SCAN as an organisation. Max, if you can go on to the next slide, please. So what did it mean for the people in our organisation? Well, as you can imagine, setting up 20 hubs geographically takes a lot of effort, and people in the Transition Network will know this. So we decided to split the work geographically and employ not one, but 2 members of staff to specifically work on managing the setup of these hubs. And we were extremely lucky. We recruited very well, and I doubt if we could have got 2 better people. Sometimes you get lucky in recruitment, and sometimes you're a bit unlucky, but we were extremely lucky. We rolled 2 sixes. We also had to employ people at each hub because the hub had to bid for the money to set up. So from going from being member-led, volunteer, a couple of part-time staff, we ballooned to over 20 staff employed very, very quickly. Next slide, please, Max. So what were the challenges involved there? Well, as you can imagine, our systems, our back office systems need an upgrade, and our admin staff, back office admin staff, need to learn a few new skills. We had to change our outlook because we were no longer this part-time organisation. We had full-time staff and huge sums of money going through our accounts. Some of the hubs that we had to set up had 14 local organisations that were involved in the setup process. And that's a lot of personalities. A lot of these personalities were at the head of their individual community organisations. So that took a lot of management. The workload was much higher than we anticipated. A couple of hubs that we were trying to set up took up that 80-20 rule. They took up 80% of our time compared to the other 18 hubs. And we were pretty naive in that. We didn't anticipate how destructive to the process that just 1 or 2 problem areas could have to that process. And there's nothing that the big climate destroyers like the big banks and the oil companies and the energy companies like than people in our space arguing amongst each other. They just rub their little grubby hands, don't they? So we tried to get out of that process as quickly as we could and sort it all out and get these other 2 hubs back into line. And we put a lot of money into that. Burnout was something we didn't anticipate. The workload was so intense, especially with some unmovable deadlines, and maybe we should have been a bit better at negotiating these deadlines. Our staff needed more time off than we anticipated, and we should have taken a better care of them. Opportunity-wise, now that the network's set up and it's a network of networks, that's a great structure to provide efficient dissemination of information in both directions. We can get feedback really quickly by just going straight to a hub, or we can disseminate events, we can disseminate new learning, training really quickly, make sure that people know about that right at the grassroots really quickly and tell them, hey, this is available for you. Threats. Well, there might be a lack of transparency coming back the way. Who wants to tell a funder bad news? Not many people or not many organisations want to do that. And what happens when these hubs funding stops? Are they going to be in such a state that they can continue and run autonomously? So that's a potential threat. Next slide, please, Max. This cartoon's got nothing to do with the slide. I just thought it was going to be late at night and I thought everybody would need a wee bit of a giggle. So I quite like this one, and I tend to pretend that the people getting the swift kick in the butt are the ones that need it, who are destroying the planet. So that's why that's there. It's got nothing to do with the slide. But questions that we raised internally. We're getting a third party to come in and do a review of the process we've went through. We're reflecting on it internally ourselves. There's a couple of things we would do differently if we were to do it again. We incorrectly assumed that what we were told was going to be happening in terms of funding actually happened, because it didn't happen the way we were told it was going to happen. And in retrospect, we should have got some legal guarantees there. And secondly, we would make sure there was a next phase to the project. It's all very well doing the setup, but then you've got to then support and help. And we, again, naively didn't think about that in advance, and it's much harder to go back and try and put in this third phase. Next slide, please, Matt. So has money changed Scan? So Scan didn't have any money, and then very suddenly it got loads of money and had a massive project to look after. Well, we can no longer use the excuse of not having the correct policies and processes in place. When you've got that many employees, you can't have a maternity or a paternity policy. So these all had to be done from scratch and then agreed. Expectations outside of the organisation on our professionalism and our delivery was heightened immediately. And we had to up our game and make sure that our skill levels were upskilled and our people were comfortable in doing the work that we were asking them to do. Internally, the team now knows what it's like to have some money in this type of organisation. And it's very difficult to go back the way and say, well, actually, we can't do what we've been doing for the next 2 years, last 2 years, because we don't have that same funding now. So that's something that we have had to manage, is people's expectations and what they can actually spend on. But on the plus side, people in the organisation also see the opportunities of what's happened, what we've created there. We've created this network of networks. They've also seen what happens when you do get decent funding and what the impact you can have. So we now have people employed in events, comms, member engagement, and the advantages of having people who are paid, not just volunteers. And I've got nothing against volunteers. I think volunteers are fantastic. But having people you can call on at any time of the day is great. And our staff and our team have seen that. So I feel like I've rattled through that, but I was conscious of time. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you so much. Fantastic. So much to chew on there, and hard-won learnings and hard-won experiences, I'm sure. So thirdly, we are joined by Josiah Meldrum from Hodmedods. Many of you may have Hodmedod products in your kitchen as we speak. Hodmedods describes itself as a small but growing independent business founded in 2012 to source and supply beans and other products from British farms. What you may not know about them is that they emerged from Transition Norwich and their Can Norwich Feed Itself report way back when. So how did they get from a small project run by the food group of a transition project to where they are now? Over to Josiah to tell us that story. Josiah.
Thanks, Rob. Max, if you could keep me in full screen, because I have some props and some hand-drawn slides. So I wanted to just really tell you a little bit about the journey that we've been on, and it's quite different perhaps to the stories that we've held already. And I've only got 7 minutes, and it starts in 2008. So I'm not quite sure if I'm going to fit everything in. But as Rob described, Transition Norwich has its big gathering in 2008, and 400 people came together in a hall, and a food group coalesced and realised that we needed to change absolutely everything, as is the way with kind of transition activities. And we decided to start by trying to understand whether a city the size of Norwich, which is 160,000 people, roughly speaking, could feed itself. And if it were to do that, how would that change land use? How would that change diets? And how could we, as a transition initiative, engage with that change process? So we started off by looking at land use and looking at diet and looking at nutrition and looking at what was already being grown and what could be grown. And we set up 3 scenarios: a kind of a vegan scenario, no meat scenario, a business as usual scenario, and a kind of midway scenario, what we'd now call in terms of meat consumption, flexitarian or less is better. And it was quite interesting because that model of land use actually worked the best. And one of the things that revealed itself during that work was something that, as someone who's worked in food for a long time, I should have been really well aware of, but that legumes, crops that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and build soil organic matter and hold water in the soil, but are also incredibly nutritious and important in our diet, are largely missing from UK food systems and farming systems. Broadly speaking, about 2.5% to 4% of arable land in the UK has pulses growing on it. And in our diets, we're some of the lowest per capita consumers of these crops. So the food group set up a small community-supported agriculture project on 9 acres on the edge of the city. It set up a mill looking at arable crops coming from the edge of the city, so grains and to make flour and bread. But we had this big question mark about how do we get these leguminous crops back into rotations and back onto plates. And initially we thought we were going to have to persuade farmers to grow things that they weren't familiar with, because those are the things that we're used to eating in the UK. So chickpeas, the haricot beans that make baked beans, and those are the one bean that we are world beating on. We eat more canned beans per capita than anyone else in the world. We are brilliant at it. And we also looked at lentils, and we realized that they weren't being grown, that they're actually really, really difficult to grow. But in the process of asking those questions, we discovered that there were pulses, leguminous crops, that farmers were growing really, really readily. One of them, I've got my first slide, there we go. There it is, looks like that, everyone will recognize that. It's a broad bean. Except in the context of farming, it's something called a field bean, and it's harvested dry like this. It's often called a fava bean. And we discovered that these beans were being grown and they were being sent to North Africa and the Middle East for human consumption, where they're eaten particularly during Ramadan, but they're eaten for breakfast and to break fast. And so we got ourselves half a ton of split beans. We put them in little bags. We later made little boxes. And inside each bag, we tucked a postcard like that, something pretty. And on the back, we had a postage paid reply. And we put them into box schemes, we took them to transition events, and we invited people to try the beans and send us back their response. And we got hundreds and hundreds back, and we've got them still, and they've all got these little notes on the back. And we realized we were onto something, and we needed to find a way to work with farmers in order to increase the production, but in order to increase the production in the way that we wanted that production to happen. So broadly speaking, as part of an agroecological food system, a system that has social justice at its heart, has the environment at its core, and is feeding people in more ways than just providing them with calories. And in order to do that, we realized that this couldn't be a project, as it were. This had to be an enterprise that was going to take these beans out to as wide an audience as possible. And we established Hodmedods in 2012 in order to reach a much wider audience. And one of the things that I think we realized early was that farmers would be much more likely to engage with us if we were offering them, one, if we were offering to buy what they were growing, and two, if we were an enterprise in a way that they understood it. And I think we incorporated as a very, not as a social enterprise, but as a limited company by shares, because that felt like the best way to have those conversations. And I think now we're in a position where we're trying to back out of that model. It's not the best model for us. And I think that's one of the key learnings that we've made. And we're now looking at how we move to employee ownership in the long term, how we change the governance and organizational structure that we've got. So I think there is some useful learning there, is that you can't change the system by trying to recreate it with a different name. And it was really, I think that was a really early learning. So essentially, we began working with farmers directly. We've built a network of 35 farmers who grow crops specifically for us. We ask them to grow them in particular ways. They're not all organic, but they're all broadly on a sort of agricultural transition plan. We ask them to grow particular varieties that weren't previously being grown. So where things like peas are being grown for drying in the UK, things like these Carlin peas were very unfamiliar. They're familiar in the north of England, but they're not much eaten in the south. And broadly, what we began to realise is that by putting pulses back in the middle of rotations and back in the middle of plates, we could really start to think about how the way we start thinking about supply systems. So we have this rather linear model of what a supply chain is. It starts on the farm and ends in a consumer, us. And it's got all of these gatekeepers that are barriers to change, and they're barriers to information, and they hold value. And it's not how things really are, but it's how we conceptualize things. It's the kind of, from primary school on, that's how we think about supply. It's a chain. And obviously chains are things that bind us. And what we really need is relational networks of supply. That's actually, well, maybe it doesn't look quite like that in real life, but that's actually how things are. We can all talk to each other in different ways. We can share information in different ways. We can share value in different ways. And if we can build these relational networks of supply, we can begin to radically change the food system. And for us, that need to change everything has become what is the lever for change within the food system that we can affect and we can find a tipping point around. And for us, that's been beans, legumes, pulses. But we can change diets, we can change food systems, we can change the relationships that farmers and citizens, food citizens have. We can move away from being consumers. And then perhaps to finish on, although we work with UK farmers and we work with people who eat in the UK, we all eat, our model has allowed us to start thinking about how we might engage with agroecological production elsewhere and how we might engage with landscapes elsewhere. And the start of that has been a project to buy Brazil nuts, wild harvested collected by the Kaiapó in the Brazilian Amazon. And the Kaiapó really struggle to finance the protection of the forest, and they really struggle to find livelihoods that enable them to stay in the forest and continue with their traditional way of life. So by paying them properly, a kind of direct trade model, we can begin to affect that change really, really powerfully. We now have, a mailing list of 40,000. We're turning over £2.5 million. We can do a lot with that reach and that impact in order to start telling these different stories. But I think the really big challenge is how do we reframe that radically in a way that doesn't make us just look like another purpose-driven business. And I think that's the thing that we really need to hold on to. How do we make sure that we're really doing the things that we say we're doing? How do we treat our staff properly? How do we engage with our farmers fairly? And those are things that I'd be really interested to chat with in the discussion. So I hope you've got some questions. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Josiah. Oh, you have set my pulses racing. And what a fantastic story, really, from beans to changing the world. Whew, right, to follow that, lastly, I would like to turn to Peter Capener. Peter is co-founder and managing director of the amazing Bath and West Community Energy, which is a non-profit community business that's been going since 2010 and which also grew out of a transition group, well, two, in fact, Transition Bath and Transition Corsham. The Community Energy Group delivers community-owned renewable energy and community-led demand management and retrofits projects and recycles surplus back into the community for action to take action on carbon reduction and fuel poverty via an independent community fund. That was a sentence with about 18 repetitions of the word community, but I kind of love it. As an editor, I'm flinching, but as an activist, I love it. Peter has nearly 40 years' experience of working on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and fuel poverty programs at national, regional, and local levels, with a strong focus on local and community action. And apparently, he was the teacher of a wayward student back in the day called Rob Hopkins. He's also co-chair of the UK Government Ministerial Advisory Group on Community Energy, deputy chair of Community Energy England, and a trustee of the Centre for Sustainable Energy. And on all that, he also has a MSc in Energy Resource Management. So quite qualified, I would say. Peter, over to you.
Grand, thanks, Anita. Let me just share the slides. Yeah, embarrassing when you read everything out like that. I have learned an awful lot about community action, in particular since helping set up Bath and West in 2010. I just want to kind of talk a little bit about our story, but in particular pick out a number of the key challenges that we faced and some of the issues and some of the learning from the scaling up that we've done. We started, like many community initiatives, as a discussion in a top room in a pub, in our case, the Ram in Widcombe in Bath, Transition Bath groups, together with Transition Corsham, as Anita says, with a particular view of looking at how can we develop clean local energy, community owned for the common good. That was the vision, if you like, trying to counter what we were seeing at the time, some very large corporates looking to build out large-scale renewables with little or cursory attention to community consultation and, importantly, community benefit. We spent quite a lot of time, and I'll come back to this as one of the key learnings, in trying to work out what it was that we wanted to set up. And part of that came out of the legal form that we selected, a community benefit society. Important attributes: it brought democratic one member, one vote, cooperative structure, but importantly also an asset lock. So meaning that all the renewable energy assets that we developed had to be held for and on behalf of the community, not for profit basis, working for the benefit of the community rather than our members. All really critical aspects of what we wanted to try and achieve. And since 2010, we've raised a lot of money to build out quite a lot of renewables, the equivalent of around about the electricity demand from around about 5,000 typical homes. So substantive, if not substantial yet, but enough to demonstrate a model that has really worked well. We've built out a number of ground mount schemes, both solar ground mount and rooftop. We've got a significant pipeline of new projects as well. On the ground mount schemes, the field arrays, a very strong focus on biodiversity, habitat creation, and also continuing food production where possible. But importantly, taking the land out of intensive agriculture, giving the land a bit of a rest. Lots of benefits from the solar side as well as just the carbon reduction. Significant amount of community amenity. We're looking at community orchards on the land as well. So it's one of the benefits of doing this from a community perspective. We have different interests in building out these projects than maybe some of our commercial counterparts. We've also developed one modern water wheel. It proved to be an interesting learning experience, not particularly something that we would do again. We are now starting to look at wind turbines and got some really interesting sites for that. But importantly, we're running some innovation projects as well, looking at how can we sell electricity directly from these projects to local communities, to local consumers. At the moment, from a regulatory point of view, that's difficult to do. We're looking at ways of doing it. We think that would be a game changer from a community perspective. Then not only do local people invest in their local renewables, they actually benefit directly from the electricity it generates as well. We just launched a home energy efficiency scheme assessment process with Green Open Homes, among other things, with a strong focus on heritage. In the Bath area, there's a lot of heritage buildings which create a lot of problems in trying to reduce carbon emissions. And we've redistributed nearly £400,000 of surplus back into local community action on projects that reduce carbon emissions, education, fuel poverty, a whole wide range of issues. And we've demonstrated this work, and interestingly now it's being recognised by the wider community. Bath Life, a couple of awards last year, which was really nice locally, but also it was really nice to see an international award from the European Renewable Energy Association picked out as a local and regional award, and they particularly focused on the grassroots action through which we were developing the renewables project. So it's nice to get recognised by the mainstream, if you like, from a renewables sector point of view too. But what has this taught us from a scaling up point of view? The first question that we asked ourselves, as Rob started off the beginning of this evening, was scale important for us? Because it might not be. There are lots of community energy projects that do like 1 or 2 small projects. That's grand. What we felt though was important was to build our vision and our strategy for delivery, and at the core of that was the employment of staff. We felt we'd seen a lot of voluntary projects in the energy space dissipate through as enthusiasm wanes, and as Josiah mentioned, kind of just relying on voluntary support is the lifeblood of community action. But if you're going to deliver consistently over a long period of time, we needed employment, and in order to do that, we needed to build sufficient scale to create enough revenue to be able to employ staff. So we moved from a voluntary organisation for the first 2 years through to an organisation that's now got a team of 20 people with a turnover of 3.5 million or so. We put a bit of time into thinking about the community business model. What was the way of generating revenue, and have been prepared to adapt over time. That's been really critical, because the energy sector, as many areas, has changed rapidly since 2010. Lots of different changes, and it's been important to be able to adapt and reflect what's going on in the world there and then. We've gone up some what's the word? Dead ends? Yes, dead ends. We've been up some dead ends, but have generated enough positive areas to be able to grow. We selected the legal form, as I said, with care. We needed to raise capital through share and bond offers, community share offers. So we needed a legal form that gave us the ability to do that. The Community Benefit Society means that we can carry out share offers that are not dependent on FSMA, and therefore aren't in themselves FCA regulated, and therefore costing 30, 45, 50,000 pounds to get the regulatory approvals each time, which would just be impossible for us. So that was a critical factor. But what we wanted to do with profit, how we wanted to generate the community benefit, and importantly, the governance, again, as Josiah was mentioning, critically important to us. So that kind of thinking at the beginning has stead us in good stead. Whilst we have changed a number of things, those core foundations have proved really, really beneficial. From a people point of view, one of the really good things that we did early on was ensure that the right people were sitting around the table. It's not always the case when community projects get going. So we made a big effort to ensure that we had the commercial knowledge as well as the community and sector knowledge, and we also needed legal expertise, and we drew that in at a very early stage to make sure that the organisation was well founded with that level of expertise. We built local partnerships. We had a very strong focus on, from the beginning, as working out what is it that we do best, and then let's get others to do the rest, because we can't, as a community organisation, just replicate what's going on in the outside world. There are some things that we were really good at and some things that we weren't. So, for example, we kind of moving into the world of local supply and shifting demand. There's a lot of software out there. Seen some community initiatives try to develop open source software, but it takes huge sums of money and resources to develop. And we think that's not the way that we need to go. We need to focus on what makes us a community organisation add value.
Just another minute or so, Peter.
Sure, thanks, Rob. Local politics, we've learnt that it doesn't have to be party political. Whatever our own party politics, we've had to work with Conservatives, Lib Dems, coalitions, at various times, local politics over the last 14 years, and realised very clearly that we didn't have to change anything that we did to get the support of those different political worldviews. We just had to change what we called things. We couldn't call ourselves a social enterprise anymore. We called ourselves community entrepreneurs. That sort of kind of stuff might seem facile or kind of shallow, but it actually makes a big difference to be able to engage with people in a way with, as long as what you're not doing is changing the fundamentals of what you're delivering. We started with something straightforward. We developed rooftop solar schemes rather than launching into wind turbines. Again, a number of community projects have fallen foul of not doing the simple things first, getting things working, getting positive feedback, building a coalition of community support first, without banging your head against the brick wall. The one big area of learning, though, was around the geographical scale. We needed an area that was large enough to create this viable delivery model, but not so large that we lost the connection with the local community. And that's been really difficult. We went through the first 5-6 years following reductions in the feed-in tariff, the subsidy mechanism, and focusing in on delivering renewables projects. And we lost a lot of some of the community connection that we started off with. And we've had to work really hard to re-embed that community connection. And so that scale of operation geographically has been an important thing, and it's been a fine line to tread, which not sure that we've still got quite right. The community governance aspect we're still working on to make sure that local communities in our area feel that they can really engage and own what we're doing. And then finally, the fundraising strategy, there's lots in there that I won't go on to, but the whole thing around building capital fundraising mechanisms that are successful alongside revenue generating opportunities. There's a lot that could be said then, learning there, that I'm happy to talk about if people have got questions. So what we've seen is a different way of doing business on energy issues, which have been enthusing for us and has clearly engaged local people in a really positive way that we've seen and had a lot of positive feedback. And so it's something that is definitely able to replicate. We're not the only organisation doing this in the energy space, but it would be great to see lots more in the future. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. Wonderful. So much to think about there. And it's been quite a feast of stories and lived experience, a rich and delicious meal of hard-won experience and possibilities.
We have a little time for you to pop any questions or thoughts or ideas that have come up throughout this evening, and also in your chat rooms, into the chat room, into the chat, so that our speakers can have a read of them, have a think about them, and we'll respond to them. As you do that, and in the meantime, and to give you a bit of a breather and a chance to do that, I would like to ask our speakers, Peter, Josiah, Craig, Taruna, and Samantha, if each of you can perhaps just come up in a sentence or two, something that struck you from listening to the other presentations that you've heard this evening. Might be something that surprised you or inspired you or struck a chord or a jarring note. So if that's okay, just a minute or so from each of you would be lovely while we get the chat organised. Let's start with Samantha. if she's there.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Anita.
Yay.
I just
That's
took it off mute there. Yeah, really amazing. I was in a breakout room with Craig, so I won't sort of comment so much back on what he said, because we explored a little bit. I think the thing for me that really stands out is that food and energy are really, really key, and it's really amazing to see things scale up around food and energy. Food production is very close to my own heart, and I worked for a long time on the food network in Leicester, and I am seriously worried by the lack of food that we produce within our cities. So it's really amazing to see that, you know, we can grow food here and we can scale up here and distribute here, you know, and do it in a really ethical way. So yeah.
Fantastic.
Lovely.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Taruna, would you like to reflect back?
Yeah, just a quick thing. Again, I think mine is on food as well. The production of food and ways of exploring better ways, especially in cities like, you know, where we live. I think there just needs to be more awareness of it. And I think the presenters gave a really great idea of what can be achieved. And I think it's something which, you know, certainly in a small city where we are, we can consider, you know, because there is a lot of consumption with like pulses and grains and things like that. And, you know, how can we sort of look at sort of, you know, thinking about where it's purchased. And I think that's the sort of thing we'd be looking to explore. So that from my end is really interesting.
Thanks very much, Taruna. Big shout out, by the way, just in between times, to the incredible Edible Right to Grow campaign, which is all about this kind of stuff. It's very, very cool. Do check it out. Next up, we have Craig.
Hi, thanks. Anita. Yeah, I was taken by the Hodmedods story, and the bravery it took to go to that next level. It takes a bit of guts to then say we're going to go and do this. So kudos to them for taking that step. And also my old background working with evil companies in my dark and distant past. I'm also taken off by the fact that they're almost, and also the energy company as well, is using the system against itself, which kind of rings my bells. So they're selling stuff for good, and using the money for good. And money is quite evil, but if you're doing good with it, then it's not so evil, in my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig. And Josiah, can we turn to you next?
Yes. Yeah, so thanks, Craig, for assuaging my constant guilt about money. But I think what's really been nice for me, just broadly, is that I don't feel I've been kind of part of the whole transition thing for the last 10 years, because we've been so focused on the beans. And it's lovely to hear these conversations and to know that there are people out there doing the networking, the community engagement, the conversations that are so important in building change. And I think developing those relationships and building trust is the key to the sort of scaling things that we're talking about. You can't do that unless you've got those trust relationships in place. I think it's hard work to do that work, and it takes persistence and consistency. And I just, you know, fair play. Well, you know, it's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Josiah. And finally, a quick word from Peter, and then we will go to some of the questions.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the presentations. I was taken by kind of the discussion in Leicester, and there's a lot I think that we could learn from the kind of cross-cultural approach that you've got there, and it's definitely something we need to improve on. But I love Josiah's focus on the kind of interconnected supply chain links as opposed to the linear thing. I think there's a lot in that would be really interesting to unpick a bit. So no, thanks very much. Really good stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you. So if you have a question, down at the bottom of your screen, you have a reactions button that has a little hand like that. And if you press on that, then we will know that you have a question to ask. So don't be shy. this is a great opportunity to pick the brains of people with years of experience under their belts. And I was just thinking, actually, for me, it's quite it's been quite moving hearing some of this, because I remember I got one of those first little boxes that Josiah was talking about with the postcard in. And I remember on the Transition Network website when we posted the first news story about Bath and West community energy forming. So it's just so glorious to see these things still going after time, and having a sort of a growing and such a good impact in the world. So yeah, so do put any questions. I can't see any hands up as yet, but our guests are very nice. They don't bite. There is a few comments that people have put in. So Scott said our group mainly reflected on the need for a collective space or a hub in our communities where all the various strands of interested parties could coalesce and enable community networking. We didn't really get the chance to talk about the presentations. And Laura says, really inspiring, thank you. It's been helpful to see how the different projects have all been struck by the enormity of the challenge in front of us, but not been overwhelmed, and have worked out where to put their focus to be effective in the right direction. And picking up on Scott's point, actually, Michael asks, I have a general query about hubs, sometimes called sustainability hubs, climate emergency centres, climate advice signposting hubs, etc. And I know there's people on this call who are involved in starting those. We're looking out for good examples of those in other parts of the UK. I wonder if there's any. Well, Rich, you've got your hand up. Is that to ask a question, or are you coming in on that?
I had a question. I paused and paused and paused because I hate dominating these spaces and taking my sort of, transition together hat into the middle. But I did have a question. But did you want to stay on Michael's point a minute longer?
Well, no, go on. We'll go with you. And then, like, if when we come to you, if any of you have any reflections that you might like to share on space and the how it was to find space to do what you wanted to do, whether that was a big thing or what you think is the role of that would be great. But Rich, what's your question?
I mean, I was really struck by the kind of combination in all the presentations about community, about people. Starting in Leicester, this collaboration between Transition Leicester and a project that's really in the heart of the Gujarati-speaking community of Leicester. And my question was, can't find it now, 1 second. Why is it important to care for community relationships when something grows? What inspiration can the project in Leicester, presented by Sam and Taruna, for example, give to more linear ideas of scaling up?
So Sam or Taruna, would you like to pick that up?
I mean, I'd say that community relations are really important, because I feel running a community not-for-profit organization, you need the trust of the community and for them to be on board, and for them to understand that you're going to be there all the time. So talking about things like climate awareness, climate action, these are quite serious topics, which, there's a level of understanding which is developed over time. So I think you need to have that community base where a number of people from different faiths, come to your activities regularly. You're providing that platform, and you're providing a safe space for those conversations, because they may be a little bit unsure about asking certain questions. So it's important to provide that safe space initially before you even think about scaling up on projects, and then sort of build on that gradually. So the project that Sam and I are involved in, it's a collaborative project. It's a pilot. We aim to get quite a lot of learning from it to see what works well, what could be improved, is the approach, the right way. So I think there's a lot of things to consider there, especially when we're working in diverse communities and the barriers associated with some of our communities in terms of language and cultural issues as well, and not prioritizing climate awareness as well. So I think from my side, that's what I would say.
Thank you. And Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just that it's really important to have that face-to-face, actually going into the spaces that people are at and meeting people where they're at. is so important. And you know, my day job is with the local authority, and there just isn't a lot of resource there to do that. And more of the services that local authorities are providing are going online, and that creates even more divide, not just the language divide, but also the digital divide. So I think the more that we can have projects that go out and put a human face on frightening issues, the more that we're likely to get people engaged in doing something about those issues.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. And I think we're all hearing a lot about building relationships, building networks, and all relationships take time. And you need to build that into your scaling up kind of time scale, that these things, they just take time because we're humans and we need to build that trust. And yeah, thank you for that, Sam. Hannah, you have a hand raised.
Hello, Hannah here. I'm from Transition Town Wellington alongside Anita.
Hi.
Hi, Anita. And my question, I think, follows on quite nicely from that discussion, actually, which is that I was going to ask about what challenges or what approaches have worked really well for increasing and encouraging diversity in the projects. I'm thinking diversity in terms of people, but yeah, I thought that would be interesting to hear from anyone about any challenges or learnings about increasing diversity amongst the people involved in the project.
Who would like to have a go at that one?
I guess I could say in Milton Keynes, we work with the citizens movement. The citizens movement attracts interfaith groups and representatives from all the major faith groups. And out of the citizens movement, we have a ACE campaign, which is Action on Climate Emergency. And that therefore has got some way around the problem that you suggest.
Thank you. Thank you. Peter, when you've been doing the community energy in Bath, how has the community engagement, how have you done that and engaging as many people as possible?
Well, as I said, we went through a phase of becoming slightly removed, not totally removed, but one step removed, because we were focusing on the projects, the hardware. And in the energy sector, it's very easy to get disassociated from people because it's all very engineering-y based, all very technically based. You can get totally absorbed by it. And I think we realized that we had to work doubly hard to overcome that. So we put a lot of resource into the community outreach and the communications approach. And so we've kind of effectively gone out on a parish to parish basis to work with local communities to help them identify what they could do in their own community from an energy point of view. And so engage communities on that basis, but at a very local level. So we started off by being very reactive to communities who were saying, we want you to do this, but realized that we needed to build that credibility, that relationship through that proactive action. So we were only able, though, to do that, to put the resource into that once we got to a size that had generated enough resource, enough kind of capacity to enable us to do that. So there's a bit of a catch-22 there. So I think making creative use of local funding and the support from pro bono kind of sources and people, particularly in the energy space, who are prepared to work at risk before projects were actually installed and be not paid anything until after that. All of those sorts of things helped build that initial capacity, which then enabled us to reinforce the community engagement and the outreach side of things.
Thank you. Thank you. Laura in Carmarthen, you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, I was really interested in the conversation around food in particular, because it's a very farming is a very topical conversation where we are in Carmarthen in Wales at the moment. And we are trying to engage with local farmers, but also people that identify, they're not necessarily farmers themselves, but they identify as people who are quite traditional and you know, like want to support farmers. So they feel like we're coming at them with this almost opposing message, I suppose, of, or being idealistic perhaps. And I'm just interested on what the experiences have been. Josiah obviously saying about they've approached farmers and spoken to them about how they grow things, but it's what were your experiences of actually getting through the door, and how did you start getting people to not see you as the enemy but as an ally? Yeah.
Josiah.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because, you know, broadly, farming isn't a job in a usual sense of the word. It's an identity and it's a vocation, and sometimes it's a vocation that people don't choose; they inherit it, and that's a really complicated thing. And if you think about it, in the UK and most of Western Europe, we have a really strange way of managing what is our most precious resource, which is the land that feeds us and the environmental goods that it provides, and all those things. We manage it largely through heredity. It's a bizarre way of managing that critical asset. And I think it's a really interesting and difficult conversation to have. So for us, that's part of the reason we chose the business model we did. We wanted it to be something that didn't look like a social enterprise, because we felt that might put up a barrier to some of those farmers that we wanted to engage with. And we didn't approach them. We've never approached them, the farmers that we work with the answers. We've approached them in a way that we're looking for answers, and we want their help to find those answers. So that's, how do we make a change happen in the context of your farm? What's that going to look like? And I think I have to be really upfront and honest and just say, you know, there are 5 million hectares of arable land in the UK in any given year. Most of it is an absolute disaster in terms of its management. I mean, that's the bottom line. We're really lucky in that we work with 35 brilliant farmers. We have more farmers that want to work with us, and more people bought beans. Quick hint. We could do more of that, but I think it has to be a process of engagement, rather than just telling people what it is that they ought to be doing. We did that when we were consultants years ago, before all of this. It doesn't get you anywhere. You go and tell people what it is they ought to be doing, and they say, yeah, of course we should. How are we going to do that then?
There's been quite a few comments and people talking about this step into employing people, to go from being an entirely volunteer project to making that decision of, right, okay, we need to start employing people here. Scott says, my main take from the presentations was about paid staff. I guess we need to hire a paid person admin now, and I'm interested in the fact these groups have changed their community business models. I'd love to hear from some of you who are in that position of paying people. Like, how was that step? How was that moment when you decided, okay, we're going to start paying people, and then you had to put in place the infrastructure to support that? Craig, you talked about how that all of a sudden came on you, and you had this influx of money and you had to start employing people, which then raised its own challenges in terms of the people and the dynamics and stuff. Have you got any advice or any thoughts for people who are part of groups that are all volunteer but are thinking, like Scott's saying here, maybe we need to take that step across into employing people?
Yeah, I mean, somebody asked me this question last week, funnily enough, and I had to think about it. But my main advice is, don't think you have to do everything at once. We did a as needed basis for our processes and our procedures. So, for instance, when we needed a process because somebody wanted paternity leave, we didn't have that in place. Legally, we're meant to. So we just put one in place as soon as we needed it. We just talked to, I think it was SCVO of a service, and we got a policy in place. It doesn't need to all happen at once. It can be excuse the pun, but it can be a transition from where you are now to where you need to get to. And just remember that you're dealing with people. Sometimes you can get caught up in the structure of these things and putting in place the IT infrastructure and users, and forgetting that you're actually dealing with people who they have problems. They've got problems outside of the job. They've got challenges that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And just keep in mind that we're in this game for the people in the first place. So, and if you ever find yourself questioning, if you ever find yourself referring to somebody as their employee number, then you need to take a step back because you've gone too far, in my opinion.
Thank you. So Peter and Taruna both wanted to come in on this. Peter, you had your hand up first. You're muted, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And yeah, totally agree. Not everything all at once. There are lots of really good sources of support. Co-ops UK provide a lot of really helpful HR stuff and policies and advice. But also, you don't have to necessarily employ people as in on the payroll. You could bring people in on a freelance basis to start off with. That means you're not committing to people for a long period of time. There can be short bits of work. You can build a team, a sense of team with people kind of loosely paid to start off with, and then kind of move on to being employed once you've got a bit more resource and capacity. So yeah, it certainly doesn't need to be all done to start off with, and there are multiple different ways of bringing people in on a paid basis.
Thank you. Taruna.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that yeah, it can get tricky getting a number of people on the payroll, and it may not be permanent. So we tend to work with the universities. So we've had a university graduate who's been supporting some of our projects in terms of the social media side and things like that, who we initially haven't been able to pay, but as a result of being involved in further research projects, we're now in a position to pay her, to recognize her for her contribution. So I think sometimes you just have to be a bit creative. 90% of people we work with are volunteers, and they're the backbone of our organization. So we recognize their skills, but we don't necessarily pay them regularly, but we recognize them and reward them in different ways. But in terms of core staff, I think depending on what projects you're delivering, you have to be quite mindful of who will be there for how long, because normally we work like 6 months to 12 months, which isn't a really long time. So we do rely on university graduates, and we've got an intern starting in June from De Montfort University. And again, they'll bring in skills which, will support our organisation. So again, it's just things to sort of think about.
Thank you. Thank you. Harriet.
Hello, I'm from Carmarthen Together, and we recently started employing people kind of out of necessity. So we had some transition funding to run some events, and when that was successful, it gave us confidence to then apply for some funding from the UK government, and we managed to set up a climate community centre on the high street. And in order to run that community centre, we decided we couldn't fully rely on volunteers, that we needed kind of consistent presence there. So we've sort of thought quite carefully about the approach that we take, and we then started hiring people, and it was quite a jump from being just a dozen volunteers who had it quite relaxed and very informal to suddenly being employees. So I would say it came out of a bit of necessity, and yeah, just I think we're very lucky in the sense that our volunteers have the experience, so we did put policies in place quite quickly. But like you say, you can just do that at a staged sort of way. Yeah, but it's been a really positive thing for us to have those people to rely on, and it's been amazing, really. So I yeah, definitely consider that if you in that approach.
Thank you. I wonder if just before we go to our keynote listeners, Josiah, do you have any reflections on how that step up was for you, from going from being a bunch of volunteers to starting to employ people? Any pearls to share?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite frightening because it's someone, you're suddenly responsible for someone, and we didn't take on our first employee until 2014. So we'd actually been running the business in a very small way for 2 years before we took that leap. And I remember it was a big decision. It was around the same time as we took on our first shed. put the beans into, and we thought we need someone to help us manage the beans in the shed. And yeah, so Joe joined us then, and he still works for us, and all our staff stay, which I think is a good thing, I hope. But yeah, suddenly you're responsible for someone's kids at home and all of those kind of things, and that's not something we'd ever done before. And I can totally understand that it's quite a responsibility and not one to be taken lightly. And you don't necessarily need to do it, as has been said. You know, using freelance people can often be a way around stepping into that responsibility.
I would like to invite our fantastic keynote listeners to join the conversation now. We'd love to hear from you, both of you, on your reflections about what you've heard, any advice for those scaling up, any words of encouragement or of warning, and any reflections on the bigger picture of where we are at. Anthea, can we start with you and then we'll move to Nick?
Sure. Thanks, Anita. Thanks, everyone. Right, I've been trying to reactivate my journalist shorthand, which has an increasingly short half-life. So let's see if I can actually read some of my scribbles, which I've been furiously making. Thanks, all of you, so much. I've really, really enjoyed and appreciated this. This discussion, particularly about the volunteer paid thing, is really kind of crunchy, and we can't get away from it. And some really sort of like big things have come up for me. I think there's about 4 things I want to say, but I'll try and let's see if it sort of comes out in the right order. It might sort of turn into a smaller number or a larger number, but I'll try and signpost them a bit. So I think I'm here because I wrote a book called The Entangled Activist, which is about how activists, and I meant activists in the broadest sense of the word. You know, we can get all sorts funny about what activism actually means, but change makers really widely, how we can end up recreating aspects of the systems that we try to change. I'd worked for years in NGOs. I'd noticed burnout, conflict, entirely capitalist working patterns, human rights defenders treating each other terribly. And I became very interested in that and wanted to kind of look into the sort of underlying patterns of what's going on. And I suppose they fit into 2 not completely separable categories, because some of it is the systems that we're in. We end up recreating aspects of those systems. You know, what are the systems we're in? We're in capitalism. We're in the neoliberal version of capitalism, which has really sort of put the market and made it sort of king of everything, and undermined the public realm. We're also in patriarchy. We're also in white supremacy. All these things are going on and arising and coming through us in different ways, depending on who we are, just in how we show up. And then as well as the systems, you know, we're humans. So we do all the things that humans do. We get perfectionist. We make in and out group distinctions and kind of build identities around that. We get righteous about our way and build groups around that as well. So I'm always kind of interested in how these patterns kind of emerge in what we're doing. But look, I definitely have not got sort of advice to offer, I don't think. But I would love to just reflect back on a few of the things I heard. So from Sam and Taruna speaking about the project in Leicester, I really heard the something about the flow between the periods of energy and the periods of retreat. And I loved your flowering bulb analogy. That's really it. That's really fantastic. And you were saying that, you know, that sometimes people, the sort of retreats of the bulb periods are because people have spun off into other projects. And I think that's happened right across the transition movement, hasn't it? That things become a thing and then the people running it are off doing that thing. But also because of burnout. So I was like holding that burnout thing in my mind. And then Craig, you were talking about, you know, what happens when the money comes. And I really found that very helpful, the way you were putting that and shaping that discussion. And of course, you know, we've been hearing in the chat just now, in the discussion section, all the dilemmas both ways about volunteer versus the money. But something that I really heard you say, Craig, was that, you know, we hadn't anticipated how intense the pressure would be. You know, and that pressure comes from inside. The expectation just goes whoop, it goes right up. And you talked about, you know, if you were doing it again, I think I heard this right, that you build some slack into the system. And so that's what I wanted to pick up with the burnout point as the first thing. And there were threads of that through all of these conversations. Because of course, you know, the basis of capitalism, and this is the system we're in, is extraction. That's what it does. And if we're not careful, those systems of extraction we practice upon ourselves and upon each other when we set up our projects. That even if we think, well, we're not doing capitalism red in tooth and claw like those profit-making businesses are, we're doing it for a social purpose, we can very easily, we've all been there, we can end up perpetuating these patterns of extracting. So what do we do? Well, I'm going to invoke Sophie Banks here, who helped generate the inner transition part of transition sort of model right from the beginning of Transition.ness and Transition Network. And I work with her on another project now called Healthy Human Culture, which I commend to you, which is building the feedback loops. What feedback loops are going to be there? It sounds like some of you have got them already and you're already reflecting on these. What are the moments, the macro ones in a project, you know, the big strategy questions about where's the space to do this, and the micro ones in meetings. Sophie always talks about, I hear her talk about this a lot, about in the, Rob, you'll correct me if I've got this wrong, in the early days of Transition Town.ness, she said there was because I wasn't here then, there was a meeting where you did a check-in and went round and everyone was asked how far they were from burnout if they continued at their current rate. And everyone was either weeks or months off it, at which point the decision was made to take on a paid coordinator to do some things, which, you know, like put some slack into the system. So these feedback things are part of it. So what else? Now I'm in a pages of shorthand. Yes, Craig, I also heard you talk about, you know, the conflict that can come up with each other in the group. And that's where I was thinking about perfectionism, possibly because I'm deep in writing a chapter about perfectionism and activism for the book I'm writing at the moment. And I would just wanted to think about how we can get attached to our ideological views on how we're doing things. And part of the slack and the system and the being kind to each other is, and it sounded like you were reflecting on this, is really thinking about how attached we get to our way of doing it, and the amount of flex that's needed in these quite fast-moving situations sometimes, to kind of allow ourselves to have enough in common to do what we need to do, but without having to line up absolutely everything. Now, I may misattribute this quote. I think it's from Loretta J. Ross, who's a civil rights activist in the US. And the quote goes something like, a bunch of people who all think exactly the same thing, that's a cult. But a bunch of people who think different things and are still moving in the same direction, that's a movement, which I really like, because it kind of like brings in that kind of allowance that we don't all have to be exactly on the same page. Now, am I all right for time? I've got a couple more things. Is that okay? Thank you. Now, this was another piece of paper. Yeah, so I heard something it's really interesting. 3 of you brought things up on this thing. So Taruna, this is about multiple ways of talking about what we're doing. So Taruna and Sam, I heard you talking about one of your challenges coming up for this project, and it sounds like you're only going into this now. The stage that you're at is being able to convince people that this matters in diverse communities, and how you're going to be able to convey that, which it sounds like it's going to require. I was hearing that it's going to require strategies that might encompass multiple ways of being able to talk about issues, perhaps different ways of like using different ways to present it, you know, beyond the sort of practical translation of actually going into different languages. There's a sort of flexibility going to be required there, which it sounds like you're very alert to. And then I heard it from 2 of the other presentations as well. So I heard an echo of this in Peter, where you were talking about the political flexibility just towards the end of your presentation. And you were like, yeah, no, we'll work with everyone. We might just need to word it differently. I love that, you know. We're not going to be social entrepreneurs. We're not going to be a social enterprise. We're going to be a community entrepreneur, and that'll tick somebody else's sort of flavor box, and then they can hear it. This is about allowing people to hear it. So I'm really interested in how we find these ways of being sort of flexible enough to present things in different ways and have I think it takes a bit of imagination, and this is why as much diversity and viewpoint in the group is important, because then we have more imagination to think about how others who are not us are going to hear it. But then, Josiah, you said something really interesting about that, because you said, I think, we can't change the system by trying to recreate it with a different name. And this was about how you'd incorporate it first as a sort of profit-making sort of company bound by shares and so on. And now you're trying to switch to employee ownership, and it sounded like you'd learned something there, which was really interesting. So yes, we do need the flex of thinking about how we present it. Am I short on time?
Yes, we're pretty much out of time.
Okay, so I'll cut there and I'll save the last point. I might put it in the chat if it doesn't come up later. All right, thanks so much.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Anthea. That was really, really well listened. And so many nice ways of connecting all the different speakers that we've heard tonight. Nick, can we come to you?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks to Rob for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for sharing a bit about your work. You know, I guess I'll start with just the standard caveat that from the distance of California to the UK, I'm going to lack a lot of local knowledge. So I think what might be most useful, rather than trying to give kind of detailed, granular advice, would be just to kind of mention some things that reminded me of your work that I have come across in reporting on initiatives, both private and public sector, kind of around Europe and also in America. I think the reason I was invited was this book that I just had published, got a nice review in The Guardian, and is also available in the UK. And it works well with the title of the event today. The book that I wrote is called The Alternative, which is an allusion, as I probably don't need to mention, to the infamous Margaret Thatcher slogan from the 80s, "There is no alternative." And so it was fun to be invited to an event about building alternatives. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is something that's sometimes called true price accounting. Other times it's assimilated to a broader kind of family of accounting techniques called true cost accounting. I just looked up a few UK examples while folks were talking, and it has some traction. So Oxford in 2020 estimated that the true cost of the UK agribusiness production system was close to $250 billion. And what they meant by true cost is if we just take a kind of wider angle lens on what it costs to produce and consume food in the way we currently do, with that wider angle, we'd want to include the cost not only to kind of human health, the unhealthy consumption of kind of food full of fat, sugar, but also pesticides. How does that show up in the health system? How will this have sort of literally and also metaphorically downstream implications, environmental, ecosystemic implications, biodiversity loss? So that's the concept, is that the cheapness of goods is in some real sense a mirage. So I picked up on this idea in Josiah's comments, but I think it was probably present in everyone's, the idea that, you know, when you buy something very cheap, maybe that's factory raised meat, maybe it's a chocolate bar with a supply chain that stretches around the world. The cheapness of that good depends on excluding a lot of these variables from how we calculate its cost. So in terms of thinking about deploying this concept, I mean, there are multiple ideas. One is an actual consumer-facing model where you actually say to people, here's the true price of your hamburger. You know, if we factored in its costs in all of these sort of human but also environmental domains, it would be $70 or 70 pounds. If that were the case, you know, you would give people a really powerful incentive to switch to eating more beans, or to switch to eating a plant-based diet that was grown locally by people paid a living wage. So it's a sort of clever way of reframing incentives such that suddenly, instead of taking all of these shortcuts at great cost to humans and the environment and then being rewarded with market share because of this illusion of cheapness showing up in the price mechanism, you reverse that, right? Of course, for that to work, you would need true pricing to be broadly adopted. But it's also kind of interesting as a consciousness raising tool, as an auditing technique. Companies use this internally, like Tony's, the European chocolate company, uses true price to audit their own supply chains. And finally, I would just sort of think about it in terms of policy. I mean, I wanted to just talk a little bit, and I'll try to transition now to another point about policy more broadly. I mean, I know folks have different degrees of influence on some of the levers of public policy, whether that's at a kind of municipal or regional or even federal level. It can feel easy, I think, to sort of give up on policy given gridlock and political dysfunction. Certainly that's the case in the States. That being said, one thing I wanted to mention that I think would interest a lot of people and that many of you are probably aware of is the model of climate budgeting, which has taken off in a lot of cities around the world. The term is a little misleading because it's not one item among others in a municipal budget. It's actually a kind of method for motivating every department within a city or a larger unit to decrease their emissions. So you have a stipulated reduction goal in emissions within a certain time frame. So I have a case study in the book that's on the city of Oslo, but cities around the world do this. So you say, look, by the year 2030, we need a 75% reduction relative to 2024 levels. Then every year, different departments of a certain city are kind of given a percentage of that goal that they have to find a way to meet. So it's a kind of interesting coordination mechanism for activating a lot of disparate sectors. I mean, like in Oslo, it's everything from graveyards to school lunches to how construction sites work, to more obvious things like increasing the cost of driving or even banning cars outright. So I just thought that might be interesting, especially for folks like working on energy, Peter, for instance, but other people. If you have some influence with policymakers, climate budgeting might be worth suggesting. How am I doing on time?
Another couple of minutes.
Okay, a few more minutes. So one final thing I'll mention, which a few people touched on similar ideas. I'm thinking of Josiah and Peter, both, I think, in different ways, touched on alternate forms of corporate ownership. So, the idea of like employee ownership and maybe more specifically an employee-owned trust, like Peter mentioned, the idea of asset lock, but sort of conceptually, I think there's at least a family resemblance to just transferring ownership of an organization into a trust so that the legal trust then becomes the owner. Employees could have shares in that trust, and the value of those shares can increase over time, so it can be a mechanism for profit sharing. One of my favorite examples of profit sharing, which is not a trust-owned business, but it's probably familiar to many of you, and it's a chapter in my book, is on the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country of northern Spain. I think this speaks really nicely to the challenge of scaling up. So it starts very small after the Spanish Civil War, in a moment of kind of acute poverty and crisis. There's hardly any manufacturing in that region of Spain. And one of the sort of defining patterns of its growth over the following decades was a kind of recognition of particular needs that were choke points inhibiting more growth. For instance, finding capital to fund more projects and then filling that need with a cooperative model. Rather than using outside capital, they would start a cooperative bank, within a supply chain, rather than trying to outsource things, which they do rely on some non-cooperative precursor companies around the world. But as much as possible, they would try to, identify missing links in the supply chain and then fill them with the cooperative model. So for people who are thinking kind of ecosystemically, I mean, I don't know the details enough to be particularly helpful in the UK example, but I think the general concept of sort of saying, here are the three things that are inhibiting us from reaching a sort of a phase transition to a higher level of scale, maybe it's capital, maybe it's bringing people on as full-time employees, and then what's a way to sort of fill those needs within structures that are broadly kind of consonant with the model we've already built. So I think Mondragon's a wonderful example of that. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick, so much. Thank you to both of our keynote listeners for such beautiful and useful reflections. And before we move to winding up, where I have a little something that I'd like to ask you to do, which is, this has been such a fascinating evening to see initiatives far into this process, although I'm sure it doesn't feel like that, and others at the very beginning. Be lovely to see what this evening has inspired you to do. So if we just take a minute in silence for you to have a think about what might be a next step inspired by this evening that you might do, something you might look into, something you might start, a meeting you might call, something like that. And we'll just take a minute in silence, and then we'll come back and we can put those suggestions in the chat. Okay. So if you wanted to just put even a few words of something that you might have been inspired by this evening to do next, something you might like to explore, that would be really, really lovely. And while you're doing that, I'm going to hand over to Anita to do the next bit. Anita.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you, everyone. We're coming to the end of the evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I have also been joined by a little bit of cat bombing, and on behalf of the non-human world out there, we want to really hope that some of the ideas and some of the also serious kind of learnings that have come out of hearing other people's stories of scaling up will inspire you to do your own thing. I'm just going to get rid of this cat. Our deepest thanks to the Transition Alive team, and especially I want to say thank you to Max for making sure all the tech worked so smoothly. Been really good to have him, a pair of safe hands on that, and to the National Lottery for making it possible, and to everyone for listening so clearly and so openly this evening. I hope that you've all had a really, really wonderful evening and continue to do the brilliant and amazing things that you already are doing.
Amen. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And thanks to all of our speakers. You've all been fantastic, and thank you for sharing your wisdom. And we'll see you at the next one of the Transition Alive sessions. Thank you so much.